Margaret Thatcher came to power on a promise to Middle England.
The things which I learned in a small town, in a very modest home, are just the things which I believe have won the election. Gentlemen, you're very kind.
Prime Minister, there's a lot of international interest.
But she saw one big obstacle in the way.
The missions of the Thatcher government was controlling trade union power.
And the miners, of course, were the daddy and the mummy of them all.
For the first time, this film tells the story of how she dismantled it.
She was micromanaging the dispute from the very start.
The cunning.
She was prepared really to use all possible means to keep the power stations going.
We can carry on for a very, very long time and shall.
The ruthlessness as she weaponized the police.
They developed a new strategy for policing. They were going to be able to draw on much greater numbers.
There's 250 pickets at Boldover.
She planned and she was prepared, whereas he postured. He banged his chest.
And the killer instinct.
Hart said, you've got to go in for the kill.
Like Winston Churchill, Mrs. Thatcher had a weakness for what Churchill called irregulars.
We needed a warrior and we needed a battlefield. And she was the warrior. She found the battlefield.
This is the untold story of Thatcher versus the miners.
There was an absolute determination, I am sure, to kill us.
This strike wasn't about wages, terms and conditions and pay. This was to save an industry. It was to save communities.
Democracy will prevail.
In the 1970s, Britain was in turmoil. The country lurched from one strike to the next. Car workers were on strike, healthcare workers, bin men. Conservative Prime Minister Ted Heath was straining to contain the trade unions. Watching from the sidelines was his 47-year-old Education Minister, Margaret Thatcher. Heath was struggling.
These are searing moments in the life of any Conservative. She knew that if ever she was in a moment for a confrontation like that, she was going to have to do better than Ted Heath.
Things got worse for Heath. In 1972, the coal miners went on strike demanding higher wages. Their union, the National Union of Mine Workers, was one of the most powerful in the country. Striking miners formed picket lines outside their pits to prevent others from going to work. Some travelled to other pits or even other industries. Known as flying pickets, their job was to form a blockade.
And one has to remember, you see, that within the mining community then, you didn't cross a picket line. So if there was a picket line outside your pit, you couldn't go to work.
On the 10th of February 1972, miners targeted Saltley Gate fuel depot in Birmingham. 15,000 flying pickets turned up to try to stop 700 lorries a day that were carrying coal from here to power stations. One man, right at the front, is leading the charge.
Hello. There's members of the Transport and General Workers Union here.
Please turn right.
What are you going to do?
What are you going to do?
No, yeah, no filming now, you see.
His name is Arthur Scargill, and this rare footage is his first appearance on a national stage.
He was a determined person, colourful, charismatic. He got the miners to believe in him, and he was a terrific leader.
He was committed to the miners and I think had a particular feeling for the rank and file and was able to relate to them.
One of the finest orators, and in my view, one of the finest trade union leaders, not just of his time, but right back through the generations.
Arthur Scargill was undoubtedly a formidable opponent. He was, amongst mob orators, he was one of the best.
Scargill forced the closure of the gates at Saltley Gate, and the government gave in. This was Arthur Scargill's first taste of victory.
What did it feel like? Absolutely magnificent.
Saltley got him into the news. It gave him headlines, gave him prominence, and it built the huge Arthur myth.
He reminds them that they have become working class heroes. So this was undoubtedly the defining moment of Arthur Scargill.
Scargill's success boosted his self-belief. Within a couple of years, he was back demanding even higher wages for his men. And Thatcher watched on as Ted Heath made a fatal mistake. Heath called an election on the question, who runs Britain? The Tory government or the miners? Heath lost.
Ted went to the country on the question, who rules Britain? And the public said, well, not you anyway.
Thatcher was suddenly out of her job as Education Minister. This is the moment where she snapped. The trade unions and Scargill became public enemy number one.
If Margaret Thatcher had been asked to draw up an identikit picture of the person she wanted to fight, it would have been Arthur Scargill. He was left-wing, very left-wing. He was a firebrand.
I think she had it in for any trade unionists, and she had seen that the miners had bested Edward Heath, so I think there might have been some sort of personal thing.
Scargill and Thatcher deserved each other. Absolutely nobody else deserved either of them. Part distorted nostalgia, part sheer bloody egotism.
Thatcher had one thing on her mind: revenge. In the 1970s, Margaret Thatcher did what she did best. She took charge. After Ted Heath lost the election in 1974, she became party leader, and then won the keys to number 10 in 1979.
Mrs. Thatcher out onto the doorstep.
So the things which I learned in a small town, in a very modest home, are just the things which I believe have won the election. Gentlemen, you're very kind.
Prime Minister, there's a lot of international interest.
As Prime Minister, it was very clear who the boss was.
She repeated simple messages again and again so the outside world understood exactly what her objectives were. So the outside world had this very clear view that she was not only clear, but also that she was almost obstinate and inflexible. The public got this woman is absolutely, clear, focused, determined.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. The lady's not for turning.
One of the missions of the Thatcher government was restoring the economic strength of the country, and that would require controlling trade union power.
The most powerful union in the country was the National Union of Mine Workers, led by Arthur Scargill.
There were pit villages, and in the pit villages almost everybody depended on mining, but 5 miles away there would be a rural village where everyone depended on farming, and the two wouldn't really have a lot to say to each other.
Traditionally, miners fight hard to keep mines open, because if they close, there's no other work for people. The whole community is dependent on it.
When pits close, it affects everybody. If somebody's made redundant, it's not just the family, it's the shops, businesses, so it's not just you, it affects the whole community.
Thatcher had one plan in mind: to dismantle the trade union movement in Britain. She wanted revenge for Heath losing the election in 1974. And the biggest obstacle was the Miners' Union and Arthur Scargill.
We have two choices. We can give in, as many German people did in the 1930s, and allow the worst to happen. Or we can fight back. This totally undemocratic government can now easily push through whatever laws it likes. Extra parliamentary action will be the only course open to the working class and the labour movement.
With Scargill ramping up the rhetoric, both he and Thatcher knew that Thatcher's ultimate war was coming.
We were beginning to realise that there was this big battle coming up.
We knew it was coming. We warned that it was coming. Arthur Scargill was saying that the government was set on closing 70 pits and that 70,000 jobs would go.
In 1981, the National Coal Board announced a series of pit closures, and the miners walked out on strike.
What happened in 1981 was very significant. There were 23 pits to be closed. Now, this had triggered off strike action in South Wales and in Scotland, and what we were getting was rolling strike action.
The wound of Scargill's success at Saltley Gate in 1972 was still festering. Thatcher's big fear was that the lights would go out. The timing for her was not good.
Mrs. Thatcher discovered that there wasn't going to be enough coal at the power stations, that there was very little prospect of being able to win a strike, and so she took the tactical decision, which is, I'm not going to go into a battle if I don't think I can win it.
Thatcher stopped the pit closure programme. The strikers had defeated her. Scargill was victorious. But his victory would ultimately be a hollow one. In his battle with Thatcher, this was his first big mistake, underestimating her. Thatcher knew this. And she also knew that all she had to do was get ready for when Scargill rallied the miners again.
She learnt that if you are going to confront the National Union of Mine Workers, you must be prepared and you must understand the politics of it. And she also learnt the absolutely overriding importance of winning.
She set about building up the supplies, the stocks at the coal stations. And really she was prepared really to use all possible means to keep the power stations going in the event of a strike.
And they would change the law so that picketing outside the power stations, as it now became called, secondary picketing, would be outlawed.
In a sign of what was to come, Thatcher got her battle troops ready. She transformed her police from separate police forces run county by county into a force that could be deployed nationally. And crucially, she applied tactics learnt in the Troubles in Northern Ireland to train the police on how to deal with large unruly crowds of protesters. This was unprecedented in Britain.
This was their three-pronged strategy to ensure that when the conflict came, they were going to win.
They were better prepared than any government had ever been before. It was planned almost like a military campaign.
It was all about taking on the unions and remaking the capitalist world in the way in which this lot wanted to do it. No resistance to whatever we want to do. That was their plan.
Spurred on by his first brush with Thatcher, Scargill demanded a pay rise for his miners towards the end of 1983. The government refused, so the miners stopped working overtime. But Scargill had miscalculated Thatcher's determination to stand firm. And on March the 6th, 1984, when news leaked out that Cortonwood Colliery in Yorkshire would be shut down, and the men would all lose their jobs, Scargill was taken by complete surprise.
The strike started when the manager at Cortonwood, who was supposed to keep it stum, had been told by the area director that his pit was probably one of them that was closing. The manager, when he got told us on the phone, opened the window because he seen the union secretary and said, "Hey, pit's closing." The cat was out of the bag.
The men walked out on strike immediately. A few days later, it was announced that another 20 pits would close, with 20,000 job losses.
What else is there in this community apart from mining? There's nothing. There is absolutely nothing for the men to do.
Caught off guard, Scargill went for the kill and called for a national strike.
The responsibility for what is taking place rests firmly on the shoulders of National Coal Board. It is they who are closing pits. It is they who are sacking men.
We shouldn't forget what this strike was about. This strike wasn't about wages, terms and conditions and pay and more wages for the individuals who work in the industry. This was to save an industry. It was to save communities. It was to save local economies.
It's something that miners have done for centuries, really. They've always had to fight for what they wanted.
But in the art of war, timing is everything. And for the miners, it could not have been worse. It was early spring. Demand for coal always drops with the warmer weather. And Thatcher had been stockpiling coal at power stations since the strike in 1981. The miners felt forced into the strike by Thatcher.
People say, why did we start the strike in March? We had little option but to start it there. She had thrown the gauntlet down. She had threatened to close Cortonwood. If we didn't pick that gauntlet up, then we'd lost. We'd lost.
I don't think this was sought by Mrs. Thatcher. It was something which she thought could happen on her watch, but in no way did she instigate it. But when it came, she was determined to see it through.
Thatcher was ready. Scargill wasn't. And when the men walked out of the collieries, Scargill didn't call a national vote. This was his next big mistake.
What she didn't anticipate was that there would be no ballot. She wouldn't in her wildest dreams have even hoped for the possibility of a divided mining workforce. And Thatcher was given that gift by Arthur Scargill's absolute determination not to have a national ballot.
On March the 12th, 1984, Scargill's call for action resulted in almost 165,000 men downing tools and walking out on strike. Over 35,000 others remained at work. Picket lines were forming outside pits, watched over by small numbers of police.
I recall very clearly, I went to work with me dad, and there was a picket line on. We observed it, and the union men at the colliery explained the situation, and said, look, it looks like we could be on strike, and we're asking you not to cross this picket line. Now we automatically, because I was with me dad, we automatically thought, that's fine, you know, we'll probably be back at work tomorrow.
Miners in South Yorkshire have a great resolve. They'll stick it out as long as need be, same as I will.
Even with no money?
Even with no money. We're determined to win this one.
The stakes were high. With thousands of jobs at risk, local communities bonded.
The gas carrier! Wait till your job's on the line!
People marched together to join picket lines.
Lots of women during the miners' strike were fantastic. We had women on the picket lines, we had women speaking at meetings, and I hadn't have experienced that sort of thing before.
We've got to ensure the safety of these men and their future.
So, you know, women during the miners' strike, you know, didn't stand shoulder to shoulder with the men. They were quite often in front of the men, leading from the front.
There was a general feeling, particularly older miners, saying young miners will never go on strike. They've got mortgages and foreign holidays. But of course, events proved that that was untrue. They did go on strike in very large numbers and were very committed.
But there were already cracks appearing, especially in communities where pits were earmarked for closure.
You have to remember that after 74, the pay was good. The conditions underground were improved. They had greater mechanisation. They had computers running the coal cutters, for heaven's sakes. So what you had then was an industry that was very attractive to younger men, younger married men, who had mortgages, who had a car in the drive. The industry had been transformed. It was now a very attractive place to work.
Miners in Nottinghamshire had benefited from modernisation, and age-old pit rivalries with their Yorkshire neighbours got very heated.
If we can't go to work, then these lot of pay, they want outing. They're no good to us at all. Let Yorkshire look after Yorkshire, we'll look after Notts.
They had different pits to us. You could stand up in their pits and dig coal. In most of ours, you had to crawl.
They had it good. Why did they want to jeopardise it? Just because the government wanted to close some uneconomic pits in South Wales or Scotland.
Don't forget, lads, you can get there. There's no argument.
Flying pickets were mobilised from Yorkshire, Scotland and even a coalfield in Kent to those parts of the country, mostly the Midlands, where miners still wanted to work. Those working miners embodied Thatcher's economic message: the right to choose.
Margaret Thatcher felt very strongly, you know, as a matter of freedom, that if people wanted to work, they shouldn't be prevented from working.
As these local miners walked in, small groups of pickets followed them.
Suddenly, striking miners were pitted against those who wanted to go to work.
There was a picket line. 3 young miners were among those who had to decide whether or not to cross it. They hesitated.
The intent, without a word being said, the intent that there was there meant, you know, there wasn't asking, there was telling.
The infighting in what had been Britain's strongest union started.
Then more local men arrived, and crossing outside the police lines, they began to walk in.
I mean, some came straight away, calling people, pardon the French here, scabby bastards.
For those who carried on working, it was frightening.
I lived in the Pit Village, and I remember one morning there was pickets all milling about over the outside the car park, and there was a line of police. I came out, and still to this day, all I remember is walking through this line where there were sort of arms like a cover like that, and there was spitting arms trying to get at me, you know, and saying, "Here's a little bastard," you know. And I went back to the car, and I got there, and I started shaking like a jelly, like it frightened me to bloody death.
Now Thatcher made her next move. She was battle ready. She launched her newly trained and disciplined police force. For the first time, the police in England were organised on a national basis. Thousands of men from all over the country were coordinated through a police control centre in Leicester. In Nottinghamshire, they slept in community centres and sports halls. They were away from home and in it for the long haul. They were highly organised, keeping tabs on which pits were on strike, which ones were working, and where the flying pickets were. It was a massive operation. Nothing like this had ever happened in an industrial dispute before.
And I find it absolutely astonishing in 1984 that we have to have 10,000 police in the Nottinghamshire and Midlands areas, something like a paramilitary state.
It was made quite clear that the government wanted the law to be observed and that they wanted the police to prevent breaches in the picketing law. It certainly was a new context for industrial relations.
They developed a new strategy for policing. This time they weren't going to be outnumbered. They were going to be able to draw on much greater numbers from different forces.
The police had often been powerless to deal with flying pickets in the past, and they became much better empowered and better informed, and that made a massive difference.
What Mrs. Thatcher cared most about was that there shouldn't be a repeat of Saltley, that miners who wanted to go to work shouldn't be prevented from doing so.
Thatcher went on a PR offensive. This was solid ground for her.
This is a dispute between miners and miners. It's some of the miners who are trying to stop other miners going to work. It is the police who are in charge of upholding the law.
On the ground, striking miners were playing a cat-and-mouse game with the police. Heading out night after night to picket other pits, the miners were thwarted at every turn. They had nowhere to go.
Yeah, X-ray Hotel 13 to move quickly to the A632.
The Dartford Tunnel last night, several carloads of miners from the Kent coalfield were stopped by police. They were strongly advised to go no further.
Yeah, just 48 carloads of pickets, and they've all swung round and gone back.
Listen to me, it's my hint to arrest you should you fail to turn around.
Well, you'll have to take me then. No.
Ah, we can't drive! How are we going on?
Thatcher's tactics were paying off. She was treating the dispute as an all-out war and organised it as if fighting an enemy.
We set up a committee, I think it was called something like MISC 101, and it met 5 days a week, and it started with a report from Department of Energy, how many miners are working, how many are on strike, where are they, plus discussion about what should the government's next move be.
Scargill's tactic of flying pickets was out of date and no longer working.
Yes, there's 250 pickets it bowls over and rising.
Within 10 minutes, I want the units out and on the road.
He needed to change tack. So he targeted this place, Orgreave, a steel coking plant in Yorkshire. If the miners could stop the lorries carrying thousands of tons of coal in here every day, they would also shut down the steel industry. But once again, Scargill had underestimated Thatcher's degree of planning.
When you look back at it, you can see that she was micromanaging the dispute from the very start. She wanted a daily report on coal stocks, on the number of people being stopped on the motorways, the number of people being arrested, the number of people working. She was getting a daily report.
Over a 2-week period at the end of May, miners began to turn up in larger and larger numbers. But the trucks kept on going.
Arthur wanted a decisive action. Arthur wanted to replicate his victory at Saltygate by having a single target that the whole of the labour movement, not just the miners, the whole of the labour movement could go to, close it down and show the power of the working class.
At Saltley, the pickets vastly outnumbered the number of police. And the police remembered that, and they thought, we're not going to allow this happen a second time.
This time, the police were well organised. They were determined to keep the lorries going. They expected big numbers of miners, and they prepared for that.
This was the line of police vehicles in what was the biggest single police operation since the strike began. Men from 9 forces converged on the steel plant, which earlier Arthur Scargill had vowed would be sealed off by the pickets.
With police arriving from all over the country, there was no way Thatcher would allow Scargill to repeat here what he had done in 1972 at Saltley Gate in Birmingham. Everything was now set for a battle. But not just a battle on the ground. This was a battle for the hearts and minds of the public.
Mrs. Thatcher was very good at doing something, what we nowadays always call the narrative, controlling the narrative. She was very good at working out what was the good side and what was the bad side and expressing it in a dramatic way.
More support, Mr. Simpson, more support!
And Thatcher's narrative was that Orgreave was all about miners' violence versus law and order. A point of view that Scargill once again underestimated. In one of the first big battles, Scargill was arrested.
No way!
Listen, whoa!
No way!
Listen,
no way!
You're blocking the footpath. Right, arrest him, then he's under arrest.
He thought it was a PR triumph.
I think that anybody that's been here today has seen police tactics of a most brutal nature. We've seen riot shields and riot gear in action. We've seen truncheons and staves in action. We've seen mounted police officers charging into our ranks throughout the morning.
Scargill's driver told me that Scargill wanted to get arrested all along. That was part of the plan. You know, he wanted to become a hero.
Arthur thought that if the public saw the pickets being attacked in that way by the police, that it would engender public sympathy for the miners. In fact, I think it did the opposite. Just didn't look right, having pitched battles with the police in that way. It didn't chime with what the public felt. Mrs. Thatcher exploited that mercilessly.
Once again, Thatcher was able to seize the moral high ground. Scargill was arrested. The miners were attacking the police, so she used the media.
You saw the scenes which went on in television last night. What we've got is an attempt to substitute the rule of the mob for the rule of law. And it must not succeed. It must not succeed. There are those who are using violence and intimidation to impose their will on others who do not want it.
But the miners kept on coming. On June the 18th, 6,000 miners turned up. This day would go down in history as the most violent of the 99 days of the strike so far. It was a bloody battle, with 120 injured.
The fighting was ferocious. There was an absolute determination, I am sure, to kill us. Absolutely certain. The only way that miners did die, and God knows enough people had their heads split open and were battered and run down by horses. It wasn't for want of trying, it was sheer fluke. And fluke, of course, that people on their side didn't die at all.
Get in here and see what they're doing.
Pickets were out there in plimsolls and T-shirts and jeans. They were no match for the highly organised police force that was arraigned against them.
Scargill himself was hospitalised with a head injury.
All I know is that these bastards rushed in and this guy hit me back at head with a bloody shield and knocked me to the ground out. The scenes that have been witnessed today at Orgreave are almost unbelievable, and nobody could have predicted that this sort of thing would be seen from our police force in 1984.
This was a critical turning point in the strike. Scargill had badly managed Orgreave, and Thatcher knew it. He didn't trust the media, and she took that as a gift. Night after night, the public turned on the news. And this is what they saw.
After 2 hours, the police were tired of being pushed and pelted with house bricks. The pickets knew what to expect. They'd been warned it could turn nasty, and it did.
Arthur Scargill absolutely forbade any journalists or cameras being on the picket side of the conflict. So all of the pictures available to the public, either in the press or on TV, were taken from behind the police lines and never from behind the miners' lines. Inevitably, the story was told from the police side of the lines, and all the angry faces were miners' faces coming at the police or when the police were charging them.
If you show night after night scenes of violence on picket lines, people think twice about whether or not this is something which they should support.
But this rare footage was shot by miners from behind their lines. The public never saw this until it was too late. Thatcher continued to spin the message to her advantage.
Mr. Speaker, those responsible for the acts of violence and intimidation have failed in their objectives to close down the steel industry, failed to prevent the movement of coal, and failed to coerce working miners into joining the strike. For that we must thank not only the courage of those who have stayed at work and their families, but also the police who've commanded widespread support and gratitude.
She was incredibly well served by Arthur Scargill because he could not speak to Middle England. Nobody watching Scargill could have thought, oh, well, he's okay, he's a nice, friendly chap, it's going to be all right. Why is she being so nasty to him? You know, no. So he, more than anyone, strengthened her in public opinion, I think.
Thatcher was winning the battle for public opinion. Scargill was misjudging things at every turn.
That was a real turning point because it indicated that whatever the union thought about the invincibility of flying pickets and mass pickets, Orgreave had proved that the police were going to throw the lot at them, that they would not be able to withstand the sort of forces that were mobilized against them.
Politically, it was massively damaging, and you could see that every day with every front page and every newscast. Margaret Thatcher, of course, fully exploited it.
One reason that Mrs. Thatcher was a skillful politician was that she combined genuine moral outrage with political cunning. She was genuinely horrified and shocked, but she also understood how vitally important all this was for how to win this war.
After Orgreave, Thatcher was on a roll. 3 years earlier, she had won the Falklands War. And now she was fighting another one.
She was a winner and she was going to win. The other side were going to lose and they'd better know it. And anybody who stood up to her was going to lose.
In a meeting of the 1922 Committee of Backbenchers, behind closed doors, Thatcher explained. Since office, her handwritten note said, enemy without, beaten him. Enemy within, miners' leaders.
Terms like the enemy within are terms that no Democratic Prime Minister in any previous circumstances since the 1926 general strike would have used, but she used those terms with relish.
They had the gall to call us the enemy within.
There was only one enemy within, and that was bloody Thatcher.
Yeah.
How dare a Prime Minister call my parents, my family, and my workmates the enemy within? How dare she do that?
We weren't the enemy within. We were fighting for a livelihood and for communities and for men to keep the jobs.
Thatcher was winning the propaganda battle. Miners were being seen as violent. Police were being attacked. The rule of law was at stake.
She planned and she was prepared, whereas he postured. He banged his chest. He shouted. There was absolutely no plan and no strategy.
Who governs Britain? Is it Arthur Scargill, or is it the elected government?
In the 1980s, miners typically earned more than most. With overtime, many pulled in well over £10,000 a year, over £40,000 in today's money. But those on strike had nothing. They weren't entitled to benefits. Families were really struggling.
A week past Tuesday, I had nothing, no food in the house, no money to buy it. We had toast for my breakfast, Toast and scrambled egg for dinner and toast for tea at night.
Mining communities suffered very badly. Children going hungry was of no matter to the government. And they were hungry and they were short of clothes and they had mortgages to pay or rent to pay, electricity bills and so on.
But mining communities had always been strong and tight-knit. One thing Thatcher did underestimate was their resilience, their ability to pull together.
There were a welfare in our community, and I went down and I said to them, can we start with a soup kitchen? We made meat and potato pies, and I could make custard for 40.
It was so important that the families were fed because they were being attacked left, right and centre in the benefit system. And lots of people lost their homes and they lost their jobs. So it was important that the community had that support.
Support came from many unexpected corners.
We had food parcels every fortnight. Came from Russia, France, Germany, and also donations from different parts of this country.
No more beans, we can't stand beans.
So we were able to feed our family that way.
There was some wonderful solidarity. The print workers from Fleet Street sent lorry loads of food and toys up to Derbyshire.
While Thatcher may have underestimated that level of community support, Scargill made a mistake here too. Believing his own PR, he thought they would suffer for the cause.
He could have changed the direction of the strike if he'd decided, look, I'm going to play on the hardship ticket. I'm going to play on the devastation that's been caused in the mining communities. I asked him specifically about the hardship, and he said, hardship, it's going to strengthen the resolve of the strikers. It's going to make them even more determined. Scargill could distance himself from the hardship that was happening in the mining communities.
The communities went through absolute purgatory, desperate poverty. And it was only the support of the miners' wives groups that was the only thing that sustained those communities throughout those months.
For some, it was all too much. 6 months without a pay packet, and they couldn't hang on any longer. They went back to work. And the strikebreakers became the new enemy of the miners. Thatcher seized the opportunity presented by the return to work. To have more men working than striking would be a big tactical victory.
She certainly believed that those miners who felt that they were entitled to cross the picketing lines because there hadn't been a national vote for a strike and who wanted to work shouldn't be prevented from doing so.
There are some 60,000 at work, and they're the ones who are honouring the NUM rule book. They've done everything right. They still pay their dues to the National Union of Mine Workers, and they believe that their way is right and they should prevail.
All she wanted to do was to get more men back at work and producing coal so that the dispute would be settled on her terms. If that meant pitting miner against miner, then that was another weapon in which to use.
Spotting a little gap, Thatcher knew she could blow the strike wide open.
That was when the battles really started in the villages. And people who had never been picketing suddenly had the picket come to them.
She wanted men back at work by any means. The police were sent in to help those who wanted to work. In some cases, hundreds of police protected a handful of miners as they crossed the picket lines.
Local communities were split. There were divisions which inevitably were extremely hostile. Not only for the miners themselves, but from their families and their households.
In Shirebrook in Derbyshire, out of 2,300 miners, 130 men went back. Taken to the pit in buses with blacked out windows.
Feeling against the scabs is very strong, of course, because by going into work, they were delivering the dispute to the government and to Thatcher. They were betraying their union, they were betraying their mates, their comrades, and they were betraying Arthur Scargill, which, as we know, is a terrible sin.
They had what we called battle buses with meshed sides, often blacked out so you couldn't see who was in the bus.
Everyone in the community became embroiled in the dispute.
It's hard to imagine how bad it actually was. They claimed to have been terrified in the buses. Well, they perhaps shouldn't have been in the buses in the first place. The most violent clashes, you know, I personally experienced during a miners' strike were people who were going back to work.
I got covered in spit and people trying to thump me and people waiting outside the house.
Now I know what fear is. I fear for my kids.
Scab! 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 The scab!
I don't want nobody calling me scabby.
They have turned their back, or their backs, on their comrades, and they've watched them suffer.
When they kept doing that, of course, it made the divide wider.
Well, will those people ever be accepted back as part of the miners' fraternity?
No. Our members wouldn't work with people who cross picket lines.
It was a unanimous decision as well.
Their families were ostracised. They were refused service in shops. They were sometimes, occasionally, physically attacked.
We knew the way. I don't know the names, but we know the faces. Two are neighbours and one lives round the corner, yes.
All they know is violence.
I'm frightened.
Desperate times. People stopped speaking for a lifetime. Families were split. People to this day can be referred to as a scab.
Felt sorry for some of them, but at the end of the day, a scab's a scab, I'm sorry. I'd never forgive one of them, ever.
But the working miners had a friend. And he was Thatcher's secret weapon.
She liked people to be close to her in government who were not actually serving in the government, but you had bright, peculiar ideas. Like Winston Churchill, Mrs. Thatcher had a weakness for what Churchill called irregulars. A bit like, much later on, Dominic Cummings called for misfits and weirdos. There was an element of that with Mrs. Thatcher.
Thatcher's secret weapon was a 40-year-old Eton-educated avant-garde filmmaker, David Hart.
David Hart was a very unusual character.
He was an interesting character.
David Hart was the son of a banker. He was a very rich man.
He was well connected in Fleet Street, particularly in the Times.
He had been a filmmaker, I think.
He had a suite of Claridges, he had a Mercedes and a chauffeur.
David was a great egotist, and he wrote a very preposterous novel. His thinly disguised hero was sort of like him saving Britain.
He was a great plotter, and he thought that he was the wizard of the operation, that he could dream of a strategy which would deliver what the government and his darling Maggie wanted.
Hart was the son of a wealthy banker. He made and lost a couple of fortunes in property. He had 5 children with 4 different women and was a declared bankrupt. But he had Thatcher's ear and worked directly to her and her alone. He started to help by raising funds for those desperate miners who wanted to go back to work.
He was the brains and the finance behind the Working Miners Committee, which was made up of dissident miners from various parts of the coalfields who wanted to go back to work.
The Derbyshire Back to Work movement is based at Sharbrook Pit.
We shall do everything possible to make sure that your wife is safe as well. The main thing is to remember that you're only a telephone call away from help.
Hart said, you've got to go in for the kill. And to do that, you've got to accelerate the return to work. And to do that, there have to be incentives. They went round to their houses, individual houses, persuading men to go back to work. They sent them letters. They offered money, quite large sums of money, for which they could pay off their debts and so on.
There was wadfuls of money coming through, basically that said, to the miner that wants to defeat Scargill.
They were seeking to pick off unenthusiastic strikers, first of all in 1s and 2s, and then in 10s and dozens.
On September the 18th, Hart wrote an extraordinary note to Thatcher, which is now in her personal papers. It read,
"Abandon all attempts to settle the strike by negotiation. Wavering miners will not return to work while negotiations are taking place or in prospect. The majority of trade union members abhor Scargillism. There is no question of surrender. There is no avoiding war. It can only be postponed to the advantage of the enemy."
The author, Niccolo Machiavelli.
When you look at it, you can see that she's underlined the key words about the need to make sure there's a total victory, that there must be no negotiations, that they must continue the strike.
The following day, Thatcher went on one of her favourite programmes, Jimmy Young's Radio 2 show.
And of course she uses some of the very same words that were appearing in David Hart's letter.
We have had all sorts of stories. First, the stocks of coal were only going to last 8 weeks, then 24 weeks, then there were going to be power cuts in August, then September, now November. We can carry on for a very, very long time, and shall.
Are you saying there would be...
Perfectly clear.
Yes.
We can count for a very, very long time, and shall.
Thatcher had more than enough coal stocks. Coal that would last for months. Hart's next step was the killer blow. Hart funded 2 miners to take the NUM to the High Court to argue that the strike was illegal as there hadn't been a national ballot. They won. At the Labour Party conference in Blackpool, Scargill was in the mood for a fight.
We've got food kitchens established in every village. We've had 3,000 of our people injured on picket lines. We've had 5 of our people killed as they fight for the right to work. For God's sake, colleagues, give support to our resolution and to the statement of the NEC and take us with you and with the NUM on the way to victory.
But while at the conference, a court order was served on Scargill inside the hall, organised by David Hart.
He hired a helicopter and sent a non-striking miner, working miner, up to Blackpool to the Labour Party conference and had the writ issued to him on the floor of the conference.
This was a knockout blow. It meant that the union had no money and could no longer fund striking miners.
Probably David Hart would have said that he won the miners' strike. He was always wanting to put himself in the centre of the stage, but he is a man of real talents, and it actually made a difference.
Once the strike had been declared basically unlawful by the courts and the union had been sequestrated, had no money, they were not going to win this. Only Arthur in his bunker believed that he could still win the war.
With David Hart winning over more and more miners, Thatcher played an ace. In the run-up to Christmas, she offered cash. Every working miner would get a series of bonuses if they were back at work over Christmas.
So if you were prepared to return to work, you would get your back pay and you'd get a Christmas bonus. Now, these were very tempting offers.
The trickle of men gradually got bigger and bigger. All along, Thatcher was aiming to entice 50% back to work. She was now close to that figure.
Mr. Speaker, there is no industrial reason why this strike should go on one day longer. And for the sake of the mining industry, for the sake of the mining communities, and for the sake of every miner and his family, I say end it now.
10,000 returned to work in the first 2 weeks of November.
Once it became obvious that Scargill was not going to win, then the miners began to go back to work and the strike began to end.
The Christmas bonus really worked. And it became clear that the strike was nearing its endgame.
You've got these charts, certainly weekly, they may even have been daily, of how many people were going back to work. And from October, I think they rose continuously. And they started to eventually to be apparent in places where they hadn't even happened at all before, like bits of Wales, bits of Scotland and so on. And so Scargillism was retreating to its sort of South Yorkshire redoubt. And you know, his troops were voting with their feet.
In February 1985, with thousands of miners returning to work every day, Thatcher was very close to her goal of having more than half the miners back at work.
There was a huge swathe of people going back. It was set for like a Greek tragedy. You knew what was going to happen. And when it did happen, it was tragic. Because all those men and their families had suffered for a whole year, only to be beaten into the ground and told, get back down that black hole.
But Scargill was in no mood for surrender and led the miners to London, still determined to win.
To show that working people are not prepared to lie down under this difficult.
The miners were behind Scargill. They weren't going back. Thatcher played her final card. She brought the Trade Union Congress to heel. An hour-long meeting ended the strike after 355 days.
Conference has decided that the National Union of Mine Workers shall organise a return to work on Tuesday.
The fact that the strike took place and was won absolutely clarified that this was the end of the trade union power that had dominated Britain for 2 decades. It was one of the biggest moments of the Thatcher government, in my view, absolutely crucial to the opening up of the economy that happened after that, absolutely crucial.
At the beginning of the strike, there were 200,000 miners in Britain. Now, there are just 1,000.
Once you'd taken them on and defeated them, the rest were finished. Nobody was going to go through 12 months of the kind of hardship and horrors that they had gone through. So effectively, the back of the labour movement was broken by that strike.
We are still paying the price. And the long-lasting effect was the virtual collapse of a lot of communities. All of that is an inheritance, not just of the strike, but the way in which the strike was treated by the system.
Thatcher said there is no such thing as society. She wanted to atomise people so they thought only of themselves and their families. But I think that there was real damage done to the fabric of our whole society.
The lesson I drew from this whole chapter is that in politics, as elsewhere, there are some battles you have to win, and there are some things you can't do without confrontation. And not every cause can be advanced by kindness, care, cunning and diplomacy. Sometimes you just have to have a fight. It was a fight that we had to have, and that we needed a warrior, and we needed a battlefield. And she was the warrior, and she found the battlefield.
Was she more saint or sinner? Our brand new original 3-part drama, Anne Boleyn, starring Jodie Turner-Smith, begins tomorrow at 9. Don't miss it. When a patient is rushed in with breathing problems, it's a question of panic attack or something more serious. Casualty 24/7, every second counts, is next.